Hello and welcome to Direct and Current, the official podcast of Electrical Business Magazine. In one way or another, growth is the goal of every electrical contractor. But ensuring that you have the measures in place to successfully manage and navigate that growth, along with the bigger projects and increased variables that come with it, is just as important to success. Software plays a key role in assisting with a number of areas across the scope of any project, from bidding to estimating and many more key management areas, which makes selecting the appropriate software to meet the specific needs of your project scale of critical importance, especially for organizations in the midst of expanding the size of projects that they're used to tackling. For today's episode of the Direct and Current podcast, and the premiere installment in our technology and software-focused Site Current miniseries, we're joined by Melvin Newman, CEO of Patabid, to explore some of the key contractor considerations for software selection, and how the size of your business and its workload inform many of the crucial criteria for making sure you're selecting the right software for the job. This podcast is brought to you by Patabid. Patabid Quantify is a modern, AI-powered electrical estimating software built to help contractors win more work. With full graphical takeoff, estimators can complete bids faster and with greater accuracy. Quantify connects directly with leading electrical suppliers like JessCan and City Electric Supply for live material pricing, so your numbers are always current when it counts. From first takeoff to final closeout, this proudly Canadian-built platform gives electrical contractors the tools to bid smarter and operate more competitively. I'm Jack Burton, and today I'm very excited to be launching our new podcast miniseries, Site Current, looking at some of the ways that software and technology are helping to transform the workplaces and workflows of electrical contractors from across the country. I'm very lucky to be joined today by Melvin Newman, CEO of Patabid, who will be providing insights across our Site Current miniseries regarding the wide array of trends and technology that are currently reshaping the role of software within the electrician's toolkit. Today, we'll be looking at optimizing construction software selection for project scale. But before we dive into today's topic, Melvin, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Could you just share a little bit about yourself and Patabid and some of the experiences and background that's helped build that repository of knowledge and expertise when it comes to construction software, especially in Canada's electrical sector?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on here, Jack.
Of course.
It's always awesome to take a moment to talk electrical and specifically the estimating side of it. I'm Melvin Newman. I'm CEO of Patabid. Kicked off my career in Ottawa with Black & McDonald as a summer student, and they were crazy enough to invite me in afterwards after I graduated, and worked with them for a number of years in the mechanical and electrical side of things. And I like to tell people that's where I worked my way up to estimating. Mm-hmm. That was only because estimating was on the second floor. And so it was my first exposure into basically the chaotic game that is estimating, and fell in love with it. Mm-hmm. And from there, did a stint with Modern Niagara on kind of the commercial side of things, moved out west here, did a stint on the GC side with Acon and that group there, and had a lot of exposure to the major side of projects and the estimating that goes into that. Mm-hmm. And then went off and kind of went back into the electrical mechanical with a Western Canadian group called Trotter Morton. And during all of that, really championed technology. Like, how do we streamline these processes, make them more accurate, more refined, and faster? And started developing some of my own kind of software tools just kind of for myself, and founded Patabid in 2017 as a hobby. Like, it was straight up mm-hmm. off the side of the desk, mm-hmm. had no major vision for it to go anywhere. And then it started to go somewhere. In 2021, it basically became a second full-time job, and I had to decide what I wanted to be when I grow up. And so, yeah, exactly. The family and I decided that, let's take the risk. We've We've always kind of been a little bit of risk takers. And so quit the day job in 2022 and went full time at Patabid. And we released the estimating platform that year, and we've been going like gangbusters ever since. It's been an absolutely fascinating career. If you've got any young listeners on here, tell your kids, if you are one of those kids, coming up to graduation, get into construction. It is the very best career you can have. I'm a huge champion for the mechanical electrical complex trades, is what they're technically called. There is so much potential. There's so much imagination, so much you can do in that field. My dad was the one who advised me to go into it when I was not sure what to do after high school. I was looking at tech, but the dot-com bubble happened.
Yeah.
And then he's like, they're always going to need to build things. And he was not wrong. It was a fantastic way to go.
Yeah, I would also say, as we'll probably get into across this episode and this whole podcast miniseries, is it's a very interesting time to be in construction or getting into construction. And so I think because of that, all that experience, it's a pleasure to have you. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we get into the actual process of selecting software to scale for electrical projects, I just want to maybe take a look at some of the clues that might signal to contractors or our listeners that it's time to start entering that selection process in the first place, or even reconsider some of their software decisions that might currently be in use. So when an electrical contractor says that they've quote unquote outgrown their current system, whether that's, simply just spreadsheets or a more robust organization-wide platform, what does that actually look like on the ground? Are there any early warning signs of those issues that our listeners should be aware of or paying attention to?
100%. And it's fascinating how that changes at every step of your company. I call these things step changes, when your company reaches a step change. So the first one is, you started your own company. And you've taken this crazy plunge and you said, you know what, I got my master ticket, I'm going to go and register Sparky Incorporated. That's like $60 to do. What nobody tells you is that's the first $60 to the most severe addiction you're ever going to experience in your life. The first step is, okay, now I need to quote work, because nobody just hands you work in this world. You have to go get it. And it doesn't matter what scale you're at. That can, like, you could be doing basement renovations, or you could be doing mass gas turbines. Like it really doesn't matter. You have to put together a quote for someone to budget this. And so the initial step is always Excel. Excel or QuickBooks or something of that. And a lot of times when you first start your company, you don't really know what's involved in the quoting. You know what you want to get paid, roughly what material costs, but the business side of it can be a massive blind side when starting out. And so pretty much everybody starts out on that Excel QuickBooks style of combo, and they're doing something, they've worked out with their supplier what it costs to install a receptacle. And they're saying, with my labor, with the material costs, it's about $230. So when somebody calls you up and says, I'm doing some basement renos, it's a very quick style of estimating. And it's honestly well suited to that Excel kind of thing. But then the next step change comes when you start to demonstrate that you're good at your job. And suddenly, one of the guys whose basement you've helped fit out, he's owner of a small general contractor. And they do a lot of, tenant improvement jobs. And he says, I love the work that you do. You've done really well at this. I want you to price this new Reitman store. And then he sends over a set of drawings. Well, this is something that you've never seen before. When you're doing basement rentals, you're not getting drawings. Now you've got a set of drawings that they're usually suspect, in the tenant improvement space, but they're there. And they're going to go into a lot of detail on the lighting and pretty much no detail on anything else. And you have to put together a price for this. So you're going to spend like 2 to 3 nights, usually starting at about 10 o'clock at night, because you've worked all day, you put the kids to bed, you had dinner, And now you can actually bid on this, but you're trying to jam that in with Excel, and
Hmm.
it doesn't work. Like, it's an incredibly slow process. You're trying to count things with markers or pencil crayons off of these drawings and dial that in. So that's kind of the first significant step change. And then you make it through that. So you're going to try to decide on a software package there. And the one that a lot of people invariably go to the first time is, say, a Bluebeam, because they're going to match that to their existing Excel process that they understand, and they just need something to count PDFs.
Hmm.
Bluebeam is not an estimating tool. At best, it is arguably a takeoff tool. But if you're doing relatively simplistic things, small projects, it can work. And so they make it through that, and they survive the job. And suddenly this GC, who is going through a step change themselves, comes back and says, "Hey, I've got this much bigger job. It's a medical center, doctor's offices, something of that nature. There's a lot more involved with it. I want you to bid that. And by the way, I've sat on this for 2 weeks while I figured out, the structural steel and everything. The owner gave us 3 weeks to bid this. Now you've got like 3 days and I need your price, go." Bluebeam and Excel fall down there very badly. And the risks go up very dramatically because inaccuracy leads to a failed project before you even know that you've started the project. And that's when you need to start seriously looking at proper estimating software, something that integrates the takeoff directly into your estimate, provides a highly detailed bill of materials that you can then price with your suppliers. So there's no more $230 a receptacle because you don't know if that's what it is. If you're doing even a dental office, they're going to have medical grade receptacles, those sort of things.
Hmm.
There's going to be wild cost variations on the
Yeah.
materials throughout these relatively simple but next level projects. And then you get into something in industrial, or what I call light industrial. You want to bid on some municipal work because it's interesting. It generally is a little more accessible, but it's a sewage pumping station. Well, now everything's explosion proof. The
Hmm.
price on that kind of stuff is all over the map.
Hmm.
And so that's where you need to get a full fledged estimating package that is tuned for these complex trades. Something that is designed to take off roofing and concrete is not going to work in the MEP space. I had some discussions with some people, and they were questioning why, in the mechanical electrical space, we couldn't do $230 million jobs in a week versus their paving group. And I'm
Uh-huh.
like, your paving group is doing the 401. They're doing 200 kilometers of the 401, and it's 6 different material types. It's 3 grades of rock and, gravel, and then like a grade of concrete and 2 grades of asphalt. I'm like, if it takes you more than 2 days to do that over 200 kilometers, you're doing it wrong. That doesn't apply when we bid a $230 million MEP job. You're
Hmm.
talking thousands of different material types with different costs for all of them. You're talking a massive plant or something of that nature. It's much, much higher risk and vastly higher complexity. So you need software that is tuned to that understanding. So I hope that kind of answers the question there. And it keeps going up. Eventually, you basically peak at those larger jobs. Like, once you reach like the millions of dollars, the software is the same. The risk analysis becomes the more critical component of what you're doing when it comes to, can the software do an automated risk analysis? Can it do that sort of thing? That's really where we get into whole separate discussions on AI and that sort of integration.
Yeah, no, and I think really you not only did you answer the question, but I think you really opened the door for just really the complexity of this whole issue. And how many zigs and zags this process might have because, you just mentioned it yourself. Project scale as a term can mean so many different things across so many different contexts, especially in a sector with as wide a variety of work as this one.
Yeah, you're totally hitting the nail on the head there. And what I've identified as really fascinating in this whole experience is the scale of the project changes, but the risk doesn't.
Okay.
Like if you as a, Sparky Incorporated basement renovations, if you blow out an estimate by 30%,
Hmm.
you're going to go bankrupt potentially.
Hmm.
If Black and McDonald blows out an estimate on some massive power dams or a nuclear facility by 30%, they're also potentially going to go bankrupt. The difference is one of you is going to show up in the news, not the other.
Yeah,
And so, like, the actual risk analysis is the same at every level of project because it's percentage based. And
hmm,
that's the really fascinating thing to consider when you're starting out or when you're working for a massive corporation doing mega projects.
of course. And so you have those constants, but I think all of that's within the context of this very sort of fluid and multivariable definition of project scale. So I'm just curious,
Mhm.
given your experience, how would you define project scale specifically for an electrical contractor? Is this something that pertains purely to dollar value? Or are there factors like supply volume, surface sizes, or the number of active permits that can add more complexity to this definition?
At its core, it's a good question. It's all about the dollar value.
Okay.
Because the rest of those have to be factored into the dollar value. And this is a major stumbling block when you reach those step changes is you don't necessarily know what you don't know.
Hmm.
And so if you can find a solid mentor or somebody who has walked before, one of my mentors asked me one time, why we hung out. He's in his 70s. And I'm like, you have to understand that I'm never going to live long enough to make all the mistakes myself. I need to learn from the mistakes of others. And so, if you can find somebody who can provide you that advice when you're in those step change moments, that's absolutely critical because I have seen massive legacy companies go bankrupt because they didn't appreciate that they were actually even in a step change moment. I literally bid a job against one of them. We were the only two bidders, and there was a $22 million variance between our two prices. And we had the right price because we had built that style of building. It was a high rise building
Hmm.
numerous times. The other company had come in and they had never built anything over 10 stories. This building was over 60 stories. Like
Yeah.
I had the advantage of having a whole team while we were bidding this who understood the intricacies of what that meant.
Yeah.
And when I was reviewing it with everybody and going through everything, it blew my mind on like how badly productivity gets as you go vertical.
Hmm.
This other company had been around for 30 years. They're no longer around. They missed that they were in a step change moment. And so that project scale, your money should always reflect the risk. So if there are multiple permits, if there are multiple services, that needs to be reflected in the price. So effectively the price is the key metric for project scale.
I think now I really want to dive into, how those differences of scales and those step changes can impact the software selection process. As you've mentioned,
Mhm.
I think recognizing that you may or may not be in one of these step change moments, it seems to, not to sound dramatic, but almost be a life or death situation when it comes to successfully navigating these projects. So I know you had mentioned risk as a constant across everything, but what would you say are some of the other elements or even core sets of software features that every electrical contractor should be looking for as they go through that software selection process? And then are there any capabilities that emerge as non-negotiables as these projects scale up?
Yeah, that is really the question. When it comes to software selection, the number one rule that I've always applied in the companies that I've worked with and have really stressed is the software must link every step of the estimate back to the source document. So and it must be the hardest possible link that's possible in software. So effectively, if something is marked up on the drawing, under no circumstances can it not be in the estimate. If it's marked up on the drawing, that needs to be the absolute guarantee, as much as humanly possible, that shows up in the estimate. If you are doing I've seen some organizations do this where they have effectively a paper or PDF takeoff process that is then hand entered into estimating software.
Mm-hmm.
There is a massive cliff of risk in that simple transition process. Somebody could mistype something. Somebody could drop the sheets or miss a file.
Mm-hmm.
And you can literally have, the worst I saw was $200,000 getting wiped out of an estimate when the sheets fell behind a person's desk and weren't found for a few months after the bid closed.
My God. The world's worst game of broken telephone.
It is. It is the very worst, and it is the highest risk. So whatever software you pick must create a hard link back to the source documents. Whether that's the drawings, the specifications, whatever it is, must be loaded into the estimate and hard linked to the values in the bid. That is absolutely first and foremost the critical piece of it. Outside of that, there's some major risk reduction pieces in there. Automated assemblies. So the ability to attach in all of the bill of materials automatically. So when you take off a receptacle, nobody's running around these buildings taping little plug symbols on a wall. Each one of those drawing symbols means 6 to 12 different parts, depending on what you're putting in.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to have the software automatically attach that BOM in for you is a massive time savings when you're doing the estimating process. And anything that you can do to save time in the estimating process is a risk mitigator overall, because you now have time to think about the things that matter. The actual counting of widgets on a drawing can take anywhere from 70 to 80% of the time to put together a bid. And at the end of the day, only contributes about 25 to 30% of the value of the bid. The lighting packages, the distribution gear, all of that, the generators, those are the big ticket items that you need to make sure are getting dialed in properly at the quote stage. Counting receptacles should be done very fast, very accurately in the software. So that's kind of the key pieces to look for there. A fully integrated closeout is essential. You do not want to do an awesomely accurate takeoff and then have to dump that out to Excel to do your actual laboring, quote, ingesting, all of that. Because Excel, as awesome as it is and insanely powerful as it is a double-edged sword. It will stab you in the face as much as it will help you.
Go on.
Yeah, like you can have a formula error that is somebody's entered an extra row to plug the new quote in for the equipment that they got, but they didn't realize that because they added that extra row at the bottom, the formulas didn't automatically extend to it. And now that $200,000 distribution gear package isn't carried in your final total number. So you need a platform that has all, and I'm talking from very painful experience. My personal worst one, it was more arguably because I misread the quote, was leaving $120,000 of fuel tanks out of a project that I was told as the estimator not to win because we didn't actually want the work at that time. And I had the privilege of telling my managers, congratulations, I got you the job you didn't want. And not only that, we were screaming low on that job. And when we finally figured out what had happened, the ops manager came to me. He's like, your punishment for this is you get to go negotiate the buyout of this equipment and you have a $0 budget.
Oh,
so
great.
That was a rather fascinating lunch meeting where I took the supplier out and explained we wanted to give him a PO. Was he okay with it being $0? And so these sort of things are what you're trying to head off. And having a fully integrated closeout facilitates that. The other part that it generates for you is the centralization of your data pool. So the front end of your business is the ultimate data pool for your company. It is the pool that is the primary leading indicator of the honestly success or failure of your business. If you don't know how to swim in that pool, how to mix that pool and read the data that's coming out of it, you need to figure that out, because we all talk about leading indicators in safety and all of that kind of stuff, leading versus lagging. By the time your PM has figured out that you're 10% underwater on a project, it's too late. It doesn't matter if the estimate was right or wrong. You're screwed. You're 10% underwater. And usually, unfortunately, that's figured out in the last 30% of the job, not at the very beginning where you could potentially start to mitigate that. Reading the data set at the very front of your company is essential. So having software that helps you assemble that data set into something that you can generate actionable decisions on, that's highly unique. And that is what you need at the very front end of your business to identify, okay, are we winning or losing right now? And what's going to happen 2 to 3 years from now based on the projects we're bidding today. So that's a key aspect of the decision matrix in the software. I mean, we could get into a lot of minutia around, the AI counting, AI risk analysis, those sort of things. These are kind of emerging technologies that are essential to factor in, but we're not entirely sure, where they're going to go these days. But they're already providing huge benefits in the software selection process.
So now we've looked at the process, I'd like to jump ahead into practice, or kind of practice. So I'm a contractor and I have my short list of software candidates. How do I do a proper and comprehensive software trial or pilot? And what does that actually look like in practice? Are there any skill dependent areas or features that I should be stress testing, but might be overlooking as well?
That's an excellent one. It really does depend on where you're, like, what step change you're at as the contractor.
Of course.
Where you're at in there, like, do you have full-time estimators? Or are you still more on the owner-operator side of things and you're looking to optimize your time so that ideally you can make it to bed and still get up in the morning, that kind of stuff. And so each one of those pieces has different aspects to it. If you're the larger corporation, you've got 3 or 4 full-time estimators, they're tasked with, really winning your work for you. So at that point, I'm more of the division manager or the estimating manager. I'm looking at, okay, is this thing multi-user? Can I assign a major project to 2 or 3 of my estimators, and can they work on it at the same time? That is a critical aspect to ensuring that these major projects get bid from the same data set. You don't accidentally have, John, the estimator, working on Addenda 1 drawings, while Bob, the estimator, got Addenda 3 loaded up in his environment. No, you need to make sure that everything feeds into one overall estimate, is full multi-user, has the permissions so that you can ensure that the junior estimators can't get to estimates that they shouldn't touch, or into the database so they can't mess with it. And then from there, it goes into, okay, where is this data residing? What am I doing with this data? How do I access it and feed it into the higher level business functions? If you're on the smaller scale, owner operator, a single estimator full-time, those kind of zones, well, now you're more interested in, okay, how effective is the automated takeoff? How accurate is it? Can it pick up stuff on curves, or does every element have to be at 90-degree angles to each other? Where does the automated pricing come from? And how accurate is that? Is the pricing my price as the contractor? Because that's essential. Or is it some random list price that was pulled off the internet or averaged from some opaque data source? That's risk.
Mm-hmm.
And most importantly for those contractors is, does it run at 1 a.m? Because that's when I'm doing my estimating. I need to make sure that the automated pricing is coming in while I'm awake and doing this for the next day's work. And where can I feed that information? Can I have some sort of automated procurement that could run from my phone, and which suppliers are involved in that sort of piece of it. Nothing is ever going to be 100% integrated, but if I can minimize the different platforms I'm getting involved in and make sure that they can talk to each other, my life gets easier when I'm assigning my 5-person crew to a job and coordinating all of that. And so that's kind of the key elements as you're looking at the needs of different scales of company, and can the software grow with me? Whether I'm small, medium, or large, I might, if I'm large enterprise, I might deploy this into my building automation group. But can it also address my electrical group when I'm ready to get them on board? Yeah. Can it address my plumbing and piping group when I'm going to get them on board? Can I find that unicorn that unifies everything? That sort of thing.
Amazing. All that being said, I do believe that is a wrap on our first episode of our Site Current podcast miniseries. But before we go, Melvin, if our listeners have any burning questions coming out of this conversation, how can they get in touch with you or Patabid?
The best way is through our Patabid contact form, patabid.com. You can email us also, info@patabid.com. Any of those ways are awesome ways to get in touch with our team here. Ryan on our sales team will reach out. If it's a technical question, I'll reach out directly. But that is the best way to reach out to us. If you want to see kind of what we do, patabid.com and sign up for a demo. That's kind of the very best ways to talk about all things awesome estimating.
Amazing. Well, huge thanks to Melvin Newman and Patabid for helping us kick off our new podcast mini-series, and to all of our listeners out there for tuning in. If you've enjoyed today's episode, good news. We've got Melvin for not only 1, but 2 more conversations, talking technology's evolving role across Canada's electrical worksites. Subscribe to the Direct and Current podcast feed to stay up to date with our Site Current mini-series and all future episodes. I'm Jack Burton, signing off.